The year was 602, and the Empire of Rome still clung to its faded glory in the east. The Mediterranean sun shone on Constantinople, where Emperor Maurice, a veteran soldier who had fought wars on the Danube and against the Persians, struggled to hold together the fragile legacy of Justinian. His coffers were strained, his armies restless, and his enemies eager for revenge. The empire balanced on a knife edge. In our history, Maurice was betrayed, murdered by the ambitious Phocas, whose coup brought years of disaster. But what if that moment of treachery had ended differently? What if Maurice survived the plot and crushed the rebellion of Phocas, preserving his dynasty and rewriting the fate of the empire and the world? Imagine the docks of Chalcedon, where soldiers loyal to Phocas gathered, blades glinting in the torchlight. They marched with fury, determined to topple their emperor and raise their general as the new ruler. Yet in this alternate path, Maurice had already uncovered whispers of the conspiracy. His spies had warned him. His allies in the Senate urged swift action, and unlike the hesitant ruler of our history, Maurice acted decisively. He summoned the elite guards of the capital, men who had served under him in the Balkan Wars, and ordered them to strike first. As the conspirators moved into the harbor, they found themselves ambushed, their commanders cut down before the crowd could rally. Phocas himself tried to flee, but was captured, dragged through the streets, and executed at dawn. The coup was over before it began. The emperor still reigned, and his enemies lay silent beneath the stones of Constantinople. The survival of Maurice changed everything. The Persians, who in real history had used his death as a pretext for war, now looked eastward with unease. For Maurice had once aided Khusro in his own struggles, and now the Persian king owed him more than ever. Instead of plunging into decades of ruinous conflict, the two great empires forged a brittle but lasting peace. Trade flowed once more through Armenia and Mesopotamia. Gold filled treasuries rather than battlefields. Soldiers rested instead of dying in endless wars. The exhaustion that had crippled both realms in reality never arrived. This stability gave Rome breathing room to face its greatest challenge on the Western Front. The Slavs and Avars, who had ravaged the Balkans, found Maurice ready and unyielding. His armies, hardened on the Danube, launched bold counteroffensives. Villages were rebuilt, fortresses restored, bridges repaired. Slowly, the Balkan frontier ceased to be a bleeding wound and became a shield again. Settlers were relocated, fields were plowed, grain shipments restored. The empire's breadbasket in Thrace and the north began to recover under the watchful eye of the emperor. Inside Constantinople, Maurice capitalized on his unexpected survival. He declared the loyalty of heaven to his rule, presenting himself as chosen by God to save the empire from treachery. He sponsored churches, expanded charities, and ensured that the memory of Phocas was forever cursed in the annals of history. The people, weary of conspiracies, rallied behind him. His dynasty no longer seemed fragile, but ordained. The consequences rippled outward, for without the chaos of the coup, there was no opportunity for rival generals to seize the throne, no collapse of authority in Egypt, no endless rebellions in the provinces. The empire did not fracture, but slowly healed, and with it, Rome's ancient pride. And yet, history is never static. For while Maurice preserved his empire, new storms were brewing to the south. Across the Arabian deserts, tribes were stirring under a prophet whose message began to unite clans into something greater than ever before. In our true history, the Romans and Persians, weakened by war, could not resist this wave. But in this alternate course, with their strength intact and their borders fortified, would the rise of Islam take the same path? Would the Rashidun armies find the same victories?
Or would the Arabian tide be broken against two empires that still stood tall? This is the turning point of our story. Maurice survived focus, and his dynasty endured. Rome did not collapse into chaos, and Persia did not march in conquest. Instead, the ancient rivalry paused, allowing both powers to gather strength. But such strength would only ensure that the coming clash with Arabia would be fiercer and bloodier than any the deserts had ever seen. The world of the 7th century was now poised for a very different fate. And in this world, the survival of one emperor could mean the survival or destruction of entire civilizations.
The empire that Maurice preserved was not a realm at peace, but it was a realm with direction and discipline. His survival marked a shift in the fortunes of Constantinople. For the first time in generations, an emperor had not been overthrown by rebellion or foreign invasion, but had outmaneuvered treachery before it could consume him. That alone gave Maurice a legitimacy unmatched in his age. In the East, relations with Persia remained uneasy, yet bound by the memory of debt. Khosrow had once been restored to power with Roman aid, and Maurice reminded him of this alliance with calculated diplomacy. Persian ambitions in Armenia and Mesopotamia persisted, but rather than open war, the two empires entered into cycles of negotiation, tribute, and carefully orchestrated border skirmishes. The costly full-scale war that ruined both realms in our true history never came. Instead, merchants and envoys traveled across contested lands, and soldiers stood guard but largely stayed their hands. The eastern frontier, though tense, remained intact. This peace freed the emperor to focus on the Balkans, where the Avars and Slavs had poured across the Danube for decades. They burned cities, enslaved villages, and carved out new settlements. Maurice understood that piecemeal defense would only bleed his armies dry, so he launched a comprehensive campaign of reconquest. Entire families of settlers were relocated south into fortified towns. Soldiers once scattered across minor outposts were gathered into legions, trained under the old Roman discipline, and drilled according to the Strategikon, the military manual Maurice himself had authored. Through years of struggle, the tide turned. The Slavic advance slowed, then halted. By 610, Roman banners flew once more over strongholds that had been abandoned for years. Cities like Sirmium and Singidunum, battered but alive, returned to the empire. Refugees were resettled, fortresses rebuilt. The Balkans, though scarred, began to look Roman again. Maurice also turned to Egypt for stability. Knowing that the breadbasket of the empire could not be allowed to fracture, he took a softer approach than later emperors did. The disputes between Chalcedonian orthodoxy and Monophysite belief had long torn the province apart. But Maurice sought compromise rather than brutal suppression. He allowed greater tolerance for religious difference while ensuring grain shipments never ceased. In exchange for stability, he granted Egyptian elites more influence in local administration. By 615, the Nile once again flowed not only with water, but with wealth, filling the imperial treasury. With secure borders and growing revenues, the empire recovered slowly but steadily. Constantinople flourished, markets teemed with goods from Africa and the East, coins of solid gold clinked in the hands of traders, churches rose with glittering mosaics. Proclamations declared the emperor not merely a ruler, but the savior of Roman order. A cult of legitimacy grew around him and his dynasty. Maurice ensured his sons were trained in both war and governance, so no rival general could claim the throne with ease. But beyond the deserts of Arabia, a new storm gathered. The Prophet Muhammad began to preach in Mecca. His message, at first dismissed and ridiculed, gained strength as tribes converted one by one. By the time Maurice was an aging emperor, the Arabian Peninsula was shifting toward unity under a banner of faith. In our history, the exhaustion of Rome and Persia gave this movement an open door to conquest. But here, things were different. When Muhammad's followers first raided Byzantine outposts on the desert frontier, they did not find weary garrisons or broken armies. Instead, they faced fresh legions commanded by veterans hardened in Balkan wars. The skirmishes of the early 620s were bloody affairs, where Roman cavalry struck hard at Arab raiders, driving them back with heavy losses. Unlike the fractured empires of reality, here the defenders were ready and organized. Persia, too, remained strong. Though rivals with Constantinople, Khosrow had avoided the ruinous campaigns of the real timeline. His armies, well-funded and supplied, patrolled the deserts of Mesopotamia. When envoys from Arabia called upon Persian governors demanding submission, their demands were rejected without hesitation. Columns of Persian cavalry rode out to scatter tribes that dared cross the frontier. The Arabian call to conquest met shields on both sides. This resistance, however, did not break the new faith. It hardened it. Tribes that once might have fled from defeat instead saw themselves as martyrs for a greater cause. Muhammad's message grew stronger precisely because it met such powerful opposition. By the time of his passing, his followers had not conquered great empires, but they had forged an identity unshaken by loss. His successors inherited not just faith, but determination. For Rome, this was both a blessing and a curse. The empire was not overrun in a single generation, but the wars with Arabia stretched into a grinding conflict. The desert tribes fought with speed and endurance, while Roman armies lumbered with heavy armor and supply chains. The clash became one of attrition, not of collapse. Skirmishes along Syria and Palestine turned into a decades-long struggle that drained resources without breaking the empire. By the late 620s, Maurice himself grew old. His sons now commanded legions, his generals loyal but restless. The question loomed, who would succeed and would they carry the same iron resolve that had preserved the empire? In our history, the dynasty of Maurice ended in blood. In this alternate course, the dynasty still stood, but dynasties are fragile things. The fate of Byzantium still balanced on succession. And as the 7th century deepened, another challenge rose in the west. Italy fractured between Lombards and Romans, Spain contested by Visigothic nobles, Africa threatened by Berber raiders. Even with Maurice alive, no emperor could fight everywhere at once. Choices would be forced, and every choice would shape the world.
The deserts of Arabia had long been a frontier of empires, a land of tribes, merchants, and prophets. It was a place that Constantinople and Ctesiphon looked upon with curiosity, but rarely with fear. That changed in the second quarter of the 7th century, when the prophet united clans that had warred for generations into one people bound by faith and vision. By the time of his death in 632, the Arabian Peninsula no longer stood divided, but rallied under leaders who called themselves successors, the caliphs. In our true history, the armies of Arabia swept like fire across exhausted realms, toppling Persia and carving Syria and Egypt from Byzantine hands. But in this world, Maurice had survived, and Persia had never endured 20 years of ruinous war. The empires were scarred, yes, but not broken. They were ready for what was to come. The first clashes came on the Syrian frontier, where Arab horsemen tested Roman defenses. They rode swift camels across the sands, striking villages near Damascus before vanishing again into the desert. The Byzantines, who remembered the lessons of Balkan raids, did not panic. Instead, they fortified their frontier towns, constructed stone watchtowers, and stationed cavalry in mobile detachments designed to match desert speed. By 635, the Arab raids were costly not only for the raiders, but for the Romans themselves. Thousands of men were penned in the Syrian wastes, fighting battles that won little land but consumed lives. Persia, too, faced these raids. The Sassanid governors of Iraq commanded elite cavalry that had long terrorized the steppe, and they now turned their skill upon the tribes of Najd and Yamama. Entire clans were scattered by charges of armored cataphracts. Persian banners flew along the Euphrates, and garrisons spread through Arabia itself. Unlike in reality, where Persian weakness invited invasion, here Persia struck first, pushing deep into the peninsula, establishing satraps in the north and along the coasts. The caliphate responded with fire and faith. They declared their struggle not merely a raid, but a holy war, a fight ordained against the arrogance of empires. The tribes, hardened by loss, rallied again and again. Each defeat only fueled their determination. Leaders preached that even should they die, their cause would not fail, for paradise awaited them. In the desert, defeats did not break them, they forged them. By the 640s, the war had become a stalemate.
Rome held Syria with walls and fortresses. Persia held Mesopotamia with steel garrisons. Arabia remained untamed, neither crushed nor triumphant. The world balanced in three powers, each unyielding. The difference between this world and ours lay in time. Instead of a rapid explosion of conquest, the Arabian armies grew slowly, learning from every clash, adapting to siege warfare, recruiting defectors from Roman and Persian frontiers. Time turned raiders into seasoned soldiers and tribes into nations. In Constantinople, the aging Maurice passed the throne to his son. The transition was smooth, a rare moment in Roman history. The new emperor inherited not a shattered empire, but a contested one. His first acts were to reorganize the military provinces, the themes, into disciplined districts that could raise troops swiftly. He commissioned fortresses from Antioch to Jerusalem, ensuring that no city would fall without months of resistance. His treasury, though strained, was still solvent, and gold flowed from Egypt and Africa, ensuring supplies could be purchased even in long wars. Persia, too, saw the passing of Khusro and the rise of his heirs, yet unlike in true history, his dynasty was not destroyed by endless wars with Rome. His son ascended the throne with full coffers and loyal armies. The empire remained centralized and strong. Persian cities thrived, trade flowed from India and Arabia, and the nobles saw no reason to rebel. Stability endured even as Arabian raids increased. But strength is not the same as invulnerability. By the middle of the century, the caliphs shifted strategy. Realizing they could not yet topple Constantinople or Ctesiphon, they turned south and west. Their fleets of converted merchant ships began raiding the Red Sea and Indian Ocean, disrupting trade lines vital to both empires. From the ports of Aden and Oman, they struck at Persian merchants from Basra and Roman ships from Alexandria. Their camel cavalry, meanwhile, swept into the deep deserts, taking oases and trade routes away from imperial agents. The empires could hold their fortresses, but they could not hold the endless sands. Arabia itself slipped ever further from their control. In Egypt, unrest simmered. Religious divisions, long managed by Maurice, now flared again as new generations of bishops resisted imperial authority. Many ordinary Copts, weary of imperial taxes, looked to the Arabs as potential liberators, though the Arabs had not yet come in full conquest. The emperor in Constantinople sent more troops to Alexandria, but each soldier he dispatched was one less defending Syria. The strain grew, though the empire did not yet break. Persia faced its own unrest. Zoroastrian priests resented the growing tolerance for Christians, encouraged by Khusro's heirs in order to appease Roman neighbors and stabilize the West. In provinces like Armenia, local nobles whispered of siding with the Arabs, who promised them autonomy if they broke with Persia. Though the Shah's grip remained firm, cracks had begun to show in the armor of the great king. The Arabs seized upon these cracks. With each year they gained allies, mercenaries, deserters from imperial armies, tribes discontent with taxation and faith. As decades passed, their armies swelled into tens of thousands, no longer mere raiders but disciplined forces with experience in siege warfare and logistics. Leaders studied Roman tactics and countered them, studied Persian cavalry, and devised ways to draw them into ambush. The caliphate transformed from a movement into a power. By the year 660, the confrontation was no longer raids on frontiers, it was full-scale war. The Arabs massed near Damascus while simultaneously launching thrusts into Iraq. Persia answered with legions of cataphracts, Rome with legions of armored infantry. The deserts between three powers erupted in campaigns that stretched for years. Cities burned, fortresses fell, only to be rebuilt. The holy cities of Arabia remained in Muslim hands, but the Fertile Crescent lay in endless struggle. Here lies the greatest divergence from our world. In true history, the Arabs toppled both empires within a generation and forged a vast caliphate across continents. In this alternate history, the empires survived, battered but unbroken. Their strength delayed the tide and reshaped it into a 100-year contest. A balance of three powers emerged: Rome, Persia, and Arabia. Each scarred, each relentless, each refusing to yield. And as this century of struggle dragged on, the Mediterranean itself began to change. New powers in the West watched with interest: the Franks, the Goths, the Lombards, and beyond them, the rising strength of distant peoples in the steppes and forests. The world was not yet decided. The fate of faith, empires, and nations would rest on who could endure the longest in this endless war of three. The world of the 7th century had been reshaped by one decision, one survival. Had Maurice fallen to focus, as in our true history, the empires of Rome and Persia would have bled themselves into weakness, inviting swift conquest from the deserts. Instead, Maurice endured the coup, crushed rebellion, preserved his dynasty, and ensured that when Arabia rose, the empires were ready. The result was not collapse, but a long war of three powers that stretched beyond generations. By 670, the Mediterranean trembled under this balance. Constantinople glittered still upon the Bosporus, its walls unbroken, its fleets patrolling the Aegean. The dynasty of Maurice had endured through two emperors, and a third now sat upon the throne. Young, ambitious, he dreamed of reclaiming the old Roman West. His armies, however, were bound in the east, fighting the Arabs along the Levant. Every campaign consumed coin and men, but the empire still drew strength from Egypt, Africa, and the Balkans. Grain fed its people, trade filled its markets. The empire lived, but at constant war. In Persia, the heirs of Khosrow maintained their grip, though the unity was fragile. The satraps of Mesopotamia groaned under endless levies of men and silver. The priesthood seethed as Christianity spread under imperial tolerance. The Shahs tried to bind their realm with pomp and gold, presenting themselves as heirs of Cyrus and Darius. Yet their empire was not invulnerable. Ambitious generals whispered of seizing the crown. Tribes on the eastern frontiers tested defenses. But still, the empire held. Persia remained a great power in the heart of Asia. The caliphate, too, had changed. Born in fire and faith, it matured in the crucible of struggle. Against two mighty empires, it had not conquered the world in a single sweep. Instead, it forged a hardened core. Tribes welded into nations, generals trained in decades of war. Its caliphs proclaimed themselves leaders of destiny. Their capital shifted from Medina to Damascus, a city closer to the frontiers of empire and closer to the riches of Syria. From there, they directed raids into Anatolia, into Armenia, into Mesopotamia. Their fleet sailed from ports of Arabia to challenge Roman warships in the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. By the 8th century, the struggle expanded beyond the deserts. The Arabs, realizing they could not easily seize Constantinople, turned westward. Across North Africa they advanced slowly, tribes there eager to throw off Roman taxation allied with them. From the oases of Cyrenaica to the walls of Carthage, Arab banners spread. Rome dispatched fleets to resist, but without the exhaustion of the real timeline, the fight was brutal and prolonged. Cities changed hands multiple times. Carthage fell, then was retaken, then fell again as the sea powers clashed over its harbors. Africa, no longer the secure breadbasket of Rome, became a bleeding frontier. Meanwhile, in Spain, the Visigothic kingdom, weakened by internal strife, watched nervously. Both Romans and Arabs sent envoys, offering alliance or submission. When the Arabs finally crossed into Iberia, it was not an easy conquest, but a grinding one, fought against Gothic nobles who received aid from Roman fleets. The peninsula became a patchwork of loyalties: Arab emirs in the south, Roman garrisons in the east, Gothic lords in the north. Iberia became a battlefield where cultures clashed without resolution. This three-way war reshaped Europe itself. The Franks, seeing opportunity, expanded eastward, taking lands once contested by Romans and Lombards. Italy, too, fractured, as Byzantine governors struggled to hold Ravenna against Lombard dukes distracted by the Eastern wars. The Pope in Rome shifted between alliances, sometimes calling upon Constantinople, sometimes favoring the Franks. A different Latin Christendom emerged, one less dominated by Rome, more balanced between competing powers. Religion itself was transformed. In our world, Islam spread swiftly across territories exhausted and broken. Here, it spread more slowly, less by sudden conquest, and more by gradual conversion. Merchants carried it into Africa, warriors into Iberia, preachers into Persia. Entire regions embraced the new faith, but others resisted, creating borderlands where Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and Islam coexisted uneasily. Constantinople remained the bastion of orthodoxy. Persia became contested ground between old fire temples and new mosques. Arabia stood firm in its faith, but the wider world turned into a mosaic, not a monolith. By 750, the long war had no clear victor. The empire of Maurice still ruled Constantinople and parts of the Mediterranean, but it had not regained Italy nor secured Africa. Persia stood tall, but internally fractured between nobles, priests, and colorful envoys. The Arabs held Arabia, Syria, parts of Mesopotamia, and the coasts of Africa, but they had not broken their rivals. Their caliphs declared victory, yet knew that neither Rome nor Persia had fallen. The dream of one faith, one empire, remained unfulfilled. And yet this balance had consequences profound and lasting. For without the swift Arab conquests, the centers of knowledge did not collapse. Alexandria remained contested, but never utterly destroyed. Persian academies survived. Constantinople endured with its libraries intact. Ideas flowed between the three powers. Trade continued even amidst war. Silk from China, spices from India, manuscripts from Greece moved across borders, carried by merchants who cared little for faith, but much for profit. The world of learning did not fall into a dark age, but into a contested golden struggle where each power sought to outshine the others in culture as well as arms. The future of Europe, too, diverged. Without the shock of losing Egypt and Syria, Rome retained more strength to influence the West. The Franks rose, but slower. The papacy turned east as often as west. The unity of Latin Christendom, that in our history forged under Charlemagne, emerged here fractured, delayed, mixed with Byzantine influence. The Renaissance of the West might come earlier, drawn not from recovered texts centuries later, but from knowledge never truly lost. By the end of the 8th century, travelers looking upon the Mediterranean would not see a world dominated by one faith or one empire. Instead, they would see three great powers locked in rivalry: Rome upon the Bosporus, Persia upon the Tigris, and the Caliphate upon the desert sands. None destroyed, none victorious, each shaping the destiny of continents through constant war and uneasy peace. This, then, is the legacy of Maurice's survival, a single moment that preserved a dynasty and altered the fate of civilizations. Instead of collapse came endurance. Instead of swift conquest came endless rivalry. The map of the world changed slowly, shaped not by sudden tidal waves, but by centuries of grinding storms. The history of faith, politics, and empire was forever different, because one emperor lived when he was meant to die.